two, one. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome, Meredith, to Ideamix Radio. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here.
So, Meredith, you're a coach who turned to coaching after having a career that spanned other industries. Tell us a little bit about how you became a coach and why you became a coach.
Sure. So having been in the nonprofit sector for most of my career, especially after getting my MBA, I realized that I had this very sort of deep passion for people and for potential. And as I grew in my career, became a chief operating officer of this international nonprofit and realized that I just wasn't as invested in the organizational outcomes as I was in the outcomes of individuals. And so the more I started sort of coaching and mentoring and even having my check-ins at work, I was definitely not as interested in how they were getting their work done as much as I was interested in how they were showing up at work, if they felt like they were having positive experiences and relationships, and if they were just satisfied in what they were doing. And so it became clear to me a couple of years ago that I really needed to transition out of the sort of operator space. And then just use my mission-based sort of social justice energy in a way that I felt could really be meaningful for myself and keep me motivated more than I had been. But then also sort of bring the gifts of mission orientation to coaching. And through my work at Harvard Business School, I'm able to meet with folks across the world and across industries. And it's been really exciting to be able to sort of see the experiences I'd had in the nonprofit sector and understand what translates across industries, what doesn't, but have just felt so sort of fulfilled and nourished in the last few years by being able to do this full time.
It's so important, I think, that history, because often we find that when clients are looking for coaches, they tend towards coaches who either have worked with other clients in their industry or have spent some time in that industry themselves. Because I think that practical experience and the way that it informs your coaching practice is very sort of subconscious and inherent in many ways, right? And I think intuitively clients sort of feel that and can see that and want the benefits of that.
Yeah. And I think that there's a real opportunity to sort of learn across industries and across sectors and across any demographic, really. But we all sort of gravitate to our comfort zone. And I think that applies in this way as well.
So I have to ask, because it's sprung into my mind and I hope you won't find it offensive. But you said, you were so interested in how people were turning up to work and how they were feeling about what they were doing and whether they were invested in the mission of the organization or not. Often people with such a strong interest in other people and how they're doing might turn to HR, right? And might become sort of HR specialists in some way. Why coaching?
So people would be mad at me for saying this out loud, but I have a t-shirt that says, "Please don't make me do stuff." And part of it is
I need that t-shirt.
There's so much process and minutia when it comes to operating organizations. And I think that for so long, I learned in every step of that progression. And by the time I got where I was helping to lead an organization, it just wasn't fulfilling me in the same way. And so I think part of it was just about how to pivot the way that I was learning and the way that I was being challenged. And, I could facilitate another discussion on culture. I could have another professional development conversation. I could think about how collaborative structures and decision-making led to organizational success or not. But at the end of the day, I was like, I've done this and I want to both become the teacher a little bit. So in some instances where I'm actually helping others learn how to facilitate and how to build culture and how to do some of these things, but also every person's unique. And so every coaching engagement is a different opportunity to sort of navigate the complexities of the world. And so I sort of had been in the people side of things being an internal like chief operation officer. And so it sort of just ran out of runway on the motivation and learning lane. And was really then sort of motivated to do this pivot.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Is there a typical client that you tend to work with?
Not really at this point, because I work with the students alumni at Harvard. It's such like people can sign up to coach with whomever they want. And so people sort of opt in to whichever appointments. And so I've had the privilege of people sort of raising their hand to work with me, all industries, all geographies, different points. I just had a coaching conversation with someone who was in her 70s and was thinking about like, what does her retirement look like? And then I have another client who's like 22 and like just out of college. And so I think it really is thinking about what the purpose of the coaching engagement is. And so I'm a big believer that like the center of everything is joy. And so anyone who's looking to bring more joy and purpose into their work is sort of a good client for me. And I'm hopefully a good coach for them. But I think this idea that we're good at so many things and we don't like so many of them. And so like, how do we actually center ourselves in this sort of spot where we're really good at what we're doing, we really enjoy it, and we're helping people or systems that are meaningful. And so when I think about coaching, it really is that center, that's sort of how I guide my work.
I love the way that you describe that, because in the end, it really does boil down to finding joy and purpose, right? And people find it consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And, at times you find it for some years and then it goes away and it no longer is as fulfilling as it was.
Yeah.
Do you find that, it used to be that coaching, much like therapy, was something that people would turn to when there was a problem, that they needed help with. And increasingly, with all the change and whether it's professional or personal, but the number of changes that each of us as individuals has to navigate in our personal and professional lives, that navigation can become an incredibly lonely process. And you sort of want someone in your corner to talk through some of these issues with. Are you finding that more people are turning to coaching, as a positive reinforcement, not just in situations where there's help needed?
Yeah, totally. I think that there's been like such a culture shift around self-awareness, self-care, self-improvement, and this idea that we're actually sort of inadvertently causing harm when we don't invest in ourselves. And so this idea that people sort of have permission now in a different way to be thoughtful and proactive and to really value themselves and their experiences in a different way. And one of the things I often talk about is like, I'm not a therapist, coaching is not therapy, but there's this moment, like the present is this moment where therapy is often really about understanding sort of how you got here. And I think coaching is often about where you go and how you get there. And that, yes, if you do therapy and you uncover like the roots of so much, then like the coaching can be more effective. But even without that, there's an opportunity to make decisions and like exhibit your own agency and how you spend your time and the kind of work you do. And so I think that there's this permission and this invitation now about sort of living your best life that I think, prior generations either weren't able to or didn't understand. And, I think the people who are sort of mid-career right now are part of that transitional wave, right? And then you have like millennials who are like, I know I matter. I know my health matters. Like, we have to figure this out. And so I think there's also this like shift of sort of the mid-senior staff of organizations that are really trying to sort of embrace what's really sort of wonderful about millennials and younger staff, while not getting like too far, of course. But I think there's just like a groundswell, a shift that invites people to do this differently.
Yeah, that absolutely makes total sense. Amplified by the pandemic and here to stay, it feels like, which is a really
Yeah.
positive development in our society.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like it's not a silver lining, but with the pandemic, like the awareness of mental health and the awareness of isolation and its impact, and just the challenges with building connections digitally. I wish I was in New York right now. So I think that there's information now that's also different and reliable, and it's not anecdotal. And that's real. And so while no one would want this pandemic to have happened, it has sort of brought to light some things that a lot of people knew were true, but other people weren't seeing.
Yeah. I want to chat a little bit about how you work with the various types of people or stage of life that you outlined many of your clients are at. Are they mostly women? Is it about 50-50 in terms of men and women?
I would say most people identify as women. Yeah. It's maybe like, I don't know, 60-40, 70-30. It's okay. I do think there's like a little bit more of people who identify as women being like, I need help. Like, can someone pay attention to me? And that is certainly, I think, more prevalent.
Well, women tend to be bigger users of coaching. And of course, being a woman, I feel this is because we have a greater degree of self-awareness in general and know when to ask for help, and are not hesitant to turn to help and ask for it. But I think that's changing rapidly as men realize it can be a resource and a support and a help and not, sort of remedial in nature.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the gender split for me is probably a little different because I'm working with MBA students often, and there are more men enrolled still. But this idea of, it's sort of interesting thinking about like women are both taught they can do it all and they shouldn't need help. And simultaneously, like, it takes a village, right? And it's like, there's no perfect parenting and you're doing it wrong. So it's like, there's all of these mixed messages. And so that's the other thing too, is I think that coaching just gives you breathing space. Like, it gives you an opportunity to actually like sit and be like, what do I think about this? What do I believe about this? Like, there's so much input and like sensory overload in so many different ways. And I think that like, coaching gives you space to be like, okay, so this is what's happening. This is how I'm thinking. This is how I'm feeling. Like, what do I do next? And that, I think, applies to everybody at this point, right? Like, that is more like, that's a non-gendered experience, but I do think that the invitation to reflect is certainly now much broader than it's ever been before. And like, people were on Zoom and saw kids running around and saw dogs and saw mess, right? And so it's like, there's a more holistic picture of what we all look like. And when we're not sort of, in cubicle.
Exactly. It was so divorced from the workplace when we were in cubicles, right? And now there's no keeping it out. We are sort of the whole people as represented on Zoom, sadly.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your process with your clients. How do you think about the various stages of coaching them through the time that you work with them?
So it varies, right, for why someone signed up. Like, is it for a session? Is it for transformation? Like, what is it in between? And so I think primarily, like, it's really getting to meet people where they are. And so what are they thinking about, struggling with, reflecting on? And then how can I help move people like really deeply into the reflection phase? So I'm a big believer that like everything is more efficient later if you know what you want. And you can only know what you want if like you know who you are. And so this idea of, so when I think about like, how do you identify like what brings you joy? I ask people like, it's not about work. Like, do you like cooking? Do you like knitting? Do you like going for runs? Like, do you like, triathlons? Like, Do you like reading to babies? Like what are the things that actually like spark joy in your life? And then how can you translate that to actual transferable skills in the workplace? And so, someone who likes to bake, my understanding is like, it's very precise, right? Like you need a lot of detail orientation. Whereas someone who might be like, cooking dinners might like just take whatever's in the cabinet and like see what they make. And so I think this idea that how our brains work actually just shows up everywhere. But if we can move people out of the sort of work brain, it allows them to be like, oh, I actually really do like this, or I really do like that. Okay, well, these actually translate into like sales skills or project management skills or customer service skills, like, or coaching skills, like whatever it might be. And so I think that there's this real opportunity to have people think about the way their brains work and the way their like spirits work as an entry point into what it is they want to do. So I think it's, it's very common where you might scour the internet and say like, what jobs are out there and how do I make a pitch that I should be chosen for this job? And I sort of invite the reverse, like, what would it be like to write your own job description and then go find that job, instead of like wasting all this time trying to like figure out how to sell yourself. And so that idea of putting, what we are naturally good at and what we naturally like, doesn't that make everything easier instead of like the slog of, getting through something? And so I think once you have that perspective, then it's a little bit easier as you're networking. You can ask more strategic questions. You can sort of, when you're asking questions about culture, it could be about like decision making, like what is the, like, give me an example of how people collaborate in your organization, or, can I like, tell me about a time when like your CEO messed up, like what happened? And so you begin to see like that you can ask questions that are not just like, do you like your job? Because someone else liking their job is not actually relevant. So like, if you are able to ask questions that can inform your own process, that's sort of what it looks like. So it's a lot of sort of, where are they, the reflection on sort of what their interest and purpose is, what is some strategic like search or networking look like, and then how do you eventually make that transition? And sometimes it's to a new job, sometimes it's within the organization, sometimes it's to start your own thing. Most of my work is career focused in some way, but it doesn't have to be.
I think you've put your finger on two things, and I don't mean to be overly reductionist, but it sounds like you're helping people build or sort of articulate their self-awareness in terms of who they are, as well as understand, as you said, how their brain works. How do they learn, what stimulates them, what brings out the best in them, so that they can actively look for those situations in the workplace or in whatever career they choose, whether it's entrepreneurial or otherwise, to expose themselves to more of what their brain likes, right? And sort of performs its natural best in. How, when you work with younger clients in particular, you mentioned you do a lot of work with MBA students, they're at the very early stages of their career. And so often, kind of write your own job description may not be as accessible to them as, say, someone who's in the middle of their career, who is looking at a very different type of set of jobs or opportunities compared to someone coming out of an MBA program. How do you adjust for that? And how do you think about that?
Good question. I mean, sometimes the students are like, great, let me write my own thing and see what happens. Like there's a real sort of hunger for autonomy and creativity in that way. So it doesn't produce the same thing, but I do think like the energy is there. It's, the focus is how, like, what will set you up best for success. And it doesn't necessarily matter what exposure you've had to a company or industry. If you can say, I want to be in a team-based environment where I am helping to like ideate and brainstorm, and I have people on my team who are really good at translating ideas to action, like that's a project manager or a facilitator or a product developer. Like that could be any number of things, but the idea that it's a clear vision.
Yeah.
So then when you go talk to people, you can be like, I think I want to do this. Like, what are those jobs? What does that look like? Who does this kind of work? Like, where should I explore? And so instead of starting from a position or a role, you're sort of starting with like, I want my day-to-day to look like this. Does that exist? Like, can I do that? Where do I find that? And so it's a similar process. It's just, I think they have a different vocabulary. But at the end of the day, if work is just how we spend our time, right? Like, how do you want to spend your time? I think it sort of creates an ability to envision that in a different way. That you're right. If you're too early in your career, you don't have the vocabulary, but you still probably know how you want to spend your time. I think the bigger shift is when people have families or they have ailing parents or they want to, settle down somewhere. I think that is much more of a transition than it is thinking about sort of those early days.
Yeah, because then there's sort of real capacity constraints in a sense, right? That
Correct.
They have to adapt to and adjust for.
Yeah, for sure.
So Meredith, we're going to do a little pretend mini coach me session.
Okay.
And so imagine I am a student coming out of an MBA program. I have a few different career choices in front of me, and I'm having trouble deciding what is best suited to me and my skills. Over to you.
When we say mini, how are we? Is this like 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 75 minutes?
8 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Hi, it's nice to meet you. So it sounds like you are grappling with a couple of different opportunities and thinking about how to make decisions. And so I'm curious so far, what have been some of the considerations that you have been thinking about or talking with folks about that even got you down to this list? And then where are you finding sort of that innate struggle that you're trying to sort out?
I have a few opportunities before me. One would be to go back to finance, which I came from before attending business school, a common path. The other is to go into an industry that I explored over the summer, which is publishing. And what interests me about publishing is the creative side of it, but this opportunity, given my background and the fact that I come from finance and an MBA, is really on the business side of publishing. And then third, I have a consulting opportunity in front of me where I could choose to specialize in an industry and go down that path to help kind of understand and diagnose problems within that industry and work with companies as clients.
And when you think about those paths that sounded very practical, what gets you most excited? Like, when do you find sort of your energy change a little bit, or you sort of perk up and listen differently? When you think about what a day in those lives might look like, where do you find sort of that spark?
So I think much of what I look for in a career and in a job has been shaped by my early experiences in finance. And two key features, which I was hugely intimidated by, but then also I found enabled me to do my best work, was the people I was around. So the sort of direct individuals I was working for and with, as well as a little bit being thrown from the frying pan into the fire and sort of made to figure it out on my own. Even though I knew I was inexperienced and ill-equipped but had to kind of go do it. But that challenge really made me do some of my best work. And of course I made mistakes, and of course I screwed a bunch of things up, but that was a very stimulating process to sort of problem solve for something that I hadn't done before and really needed to figure out.
Yeah. So part of it sounds like it's a learning orientation. So making sure that it's sort of potentially different stuff. You're experimenting and experiencing as you go. Given that you have some experience and comfort in finance, is there a part of you that is sort of craving that sort of safety net? Or is it actually just like your logical brain is saying, you can do well at this, you have a good path ahead of you? Where do you sort of fall on that continuum?
One of the reasons I went to business school was because I was feeling a little bored with finance. And at the same time, as I sit here and consider my options, it's a very safe path. And I did well at it and know I could continue to do well at it. At the same time, I'm excited by the challenge of a different industry and learning a different set of skills and working with a different set of people.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about those other options, so thinking about the publishing piece, right? So you mentioned that you have this creative energy you're excited about, but that you'd be on the business side of things. When you reconcile that, do you see it as a way into a creative industry, or could you actually see yourself getting some of that creative energy because you're in that space and you don't actually need to be like directly in it? So how much of it do you see as like a path into a situation versus more of a path you can stay on and be excited about?
I definitely view it as a path into a situation, because what's exciting about publishing is the creative side to me, but it's not an entry point that's accessible to me today.
Yeah.
That said, if I were number counting, then I'd almost rather do that in finance than be totally disconnected from a creative process and still be number counting.
Yeah.
Because at least in finance, you're part of the creative process because it's the nature of what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. What is it, the creative bug? Is it, do you enjoy writing? Do you enjoy performing? What is that sort of grounded in?
I enjoy writing, performing. I have done that in the past. And at the same time, I'm not the sort of person who would take the plunge to go be a writer or go be a performer. I don't know that I want that to be my career, particularly.
What do you see as sort of the unappealing aspects of that?
I don't know if I could take the rejection.
That is a very helpful insight, right? So to think about where you can find the balance of risk and success, right? So rejection in a creative space sounds like it might feel really personal. Whereas if you get like a deal gets turned down, your consulting project gets turned down, like it's less about you. Is that how, that's what it seemed like you were saying? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, when you're turned down because of something you wrote or a role you tried out for, it's all about you in a sense, right? Whereas a project or a deal or whatever is sort of, sure, I mean, you're very much a part of it, but it's a manifestation of in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last one you mentioned is consulting, and you said it was sort of a pathway into sort of a more specific industry. So sometimes consulting, you can sort of stay in the strategic management gray space. When you talk about going into an industry, is that because you want to, or is that because that's sort of been the offer put ahead of you?
It has been an interest of mine. So I've wanted to learn more about the consumer retail industry. And so that's really the opportunity that I went after with respect to consulting. And so that is an opportunity. But what worries me about it is a little bit what we were saying about publishing, that you're learning a great deal about the workings of the industry, but you're still disconnected from the creative process. So how much impact can you have is a little bit the question mark in my mind.
And how do you define impact in that way?
I think it's tangibility for me, like an outcome that really derived from something that I played a key role in. I know it's not, in very few settings at this stage of my career am I going to be doing something on my own. And so it's like a direct one-to-one thing, but I want to feel a tangible sense of influence and impact on an outcome.
Yeah. And so as you think about this next phase, do you have a sense of what you want your day-to-day to look like? So regardless of which of these paths you end up on or another, do you sort of have intuition about how you want to spend your time, what kind of work, like kind of pace, frenzy, time, like how do you envision that sort of ideal state at this point?
I want some balance. I mean, working in finance, I had none. And now I'm at a different stage where I'm about to get married. And so there are going to be other obligations that arise coming out of that, and other ways that I want to spend my time. So I also don't want to be working, 20-hour days all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things you said as you were talking was that you weren't able to do that when you were in finance. And so it's interesting that both in your, in the answer to what do you want, you actually call out one of these things as something you don't want. And so is there a lane within finance that you have in your mind that sounds like an appealing opportunity? Like it's such a big word. Do you see something where you have more of that balance and interest? You're still learning, you're still engaged with people, or does that actually not exist in your mind?
No, I do. I think wealth management within finance is an area like that, where you can have a greater degree of control over your life and have a bit more balance, but also have a creative space and that tangibility of the direct relation between sort of your work and, client impact or bringing in a client or whatever it is that you're working on. I wouldn't go back to doing what I was doing before, where I felt like I had very little control over my hours or balance.
Yeah. So thinking about, you're about to go into this next phase of your life, you're graduating, potential like families on the horizon. When you want to tell your story about what you did in this window of time, what do you think are some of those key messages that you're going to feel excited or proud to share?
That's a great question. I think three things. I want to feel that I learned something new and sort of grew my skill set. I want to feel as though I worked with a set of people with whom I developed deep relationships and connections, and I was as invested in them as they were in me. And I want to feel, not, on a daily basis, but in the aggregate, I want to feel that sense of direct, tangible impact.
And so if you were to think about when each of these different opportunities, one of the things you might consider is really mapping out what those learning opportunities and objectives are, what the sort of culture and collaboration opportunities are, and continuing to really refine what impact means to you at different stages, right? So you have this sort of first stage of your career, there is a way to define impact now, which will be different than further down the road. There's also the impact on yourself, on your neighbors, on your colleagues, on the industry. And so you have these three dimensions. And so doing some more reflection on how those will really line up for you, and then being able to talk to people who can answer some questions for you that are about you, right? So instead of saying like, what did you learn in your, job, Sam? Like, you don't need to actually ask those questions. You can say, I'm really excited about learning. What is a learning environment like? How does your, company think about professional development? Do you have access to leaders and mentors? And so I think as you can begin to articulate what these 3 points are within each of the opportunities you've talked about, then going out and asking people, like testing those hypotheses and saying, like, I think this is what it would look like to be in this line of work. Am I right? Is it true? And as you get additional information, like continuing to use that as a filter, to narrow in some of your decision making. And obviously, like, depending on where you are in your journey, it could be that you're looking at offers. It could be that you're looking at interviews. We probably would have talked about that at the beginning. But I think knowing how much runway you have to get more information, to test these hypotheses, can potentially lead to a really sort of holistic decision that will feed these different parts of you in ways that will be different and hopefully better than some of the others.
Wonderful. That's great advice. Thank you.
And scene.
Exactly. That was great. It's so, it's fun to do that, A, but B, it's such a useful lens for our listeners who are curious about coaching and what that actually is and what it looks like, and with a particular coach to understand that. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. It's good practice. But it's also like everyone's style is so different. Their energy, their tone.
Totally.
Some people are like tactical, like let's get in it. And obviously that is not necessarily my approach. But it is fun to just see where these conversations go, like no matter how like real or made up they are.
No, totally.
Exciting.
Well, I so appreciate having you on the show, and thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. It was nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Okay.
Thanks for listening today. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please do review the show. We love hearing from you. So email us at info@theideamix.com or Instagram DM us. Our episode this week was produced by the incomparable Martin Milewski, with music by the awesome Nashville-based singer-songwriter Doug Allen. You can learn more about Doug at dougallenmusic.com.